Kunark, a land of great beauty, but also a land of conflict and cruelty. And from the moment mortal races first set foot on its surface, it is a land that has never truly known peace. The story of Kunark is, at its heart, the story of the Xar. There are other players in Kunark's long and violent history, but at every stage the Xar are central to the story, and are the thread that ties everything together. At the dawn of the Age of Monuments, Khazad-Thul arrived on Norath and saw that his fellow gods had planted races in their images. Khazad did not want to be left out. He found an untouched corner of this fresh world, and on it he planted two races, the Chisar and the Xar, and into them he poured his hatred, cruelty, and lust for violence. He created them to, at their very core, strive to dominate through fear and oppression, to show no mercy to their enemies. The stronger of the two races, the Chisar, quickly came to dominate the Xar and enslaved them. The Chisar quickly grew into an empire thanks in large part to the enslaved Xar, who made up the bulk of their workforce and armies. Unwilling to risk any of the credit for their great empire to fall on the Xar, at the peak of their power the Chisar committed the blasphemy of claiming that it was they who created the Xar, for the sole purpose of being slaves to the Empire. Surely Khazad-Thul would remember this when it eventually came time for the Chisar to face his judgment. Having the Xar at their disposal freed up the Chisar to pursue even greater power through the dark arts. The Chisar developed teleportation magic that allowed them to move freely between Norath and the planes of the gods themselves. The Chisar plundered these realms, taking items of great power and knowledge that they should not have had. They began to think of themselves as gods. If there was one thing the Chisar had in abundance, it was hubris, and hubris would be the cause of their downfall. Khazad-Thul saw all of this and decided to put the Chisar in their place. He had created them to cower before him, and now they fancied themselves his equal. So he sent a green mist that spread across Kunark, killing any Chisar that it touched. The green mist was said to melt the very flesh from Chisar bones, turning the streets of their cities into rivers of blood and flesh. The elites of the Chisar Empire retreated to the city of Chelsith, their capital and fortress, where they desperately tried to find a way to fight the green mist. In the end, they were no match for the mist sent by Khazad-Thul. They were not his equal, after all. The Chisar had no choice but to abandon Norath and teleport their entire city to the surface of Lucklan, where they erected a magical dome, allowing no air inside, so there was no way the green mist could follow them. The green mist that wiped out the Chisar had no effect on the Xar, who suddenly found themselves to be free, with no masters to oppress them. But as I said earlier, Khazad-Thul did not design his children for peace. The Xar divided into 5 tribes: the Kailong, Nathzar, Obulis, Jarsath, and Kunzar. The 5 Xar tribes fought amongst each other while fighting the other races of Kunark, the giants, froglucks, and goblins. Over the centuries after the disappearance of the Chisar, the Xar expanded to control large portions of Kunark, but there was one power that the individual Xar tribes were no match for: the Ring of Scale. So before we get too deep into the Xar timeline, let's take a minute to get up to speed on the dragons of Kunark. I talked a bit about the Ring of Scale in my Scars of Velios video, but I'll refresh that a bit here. The dragons originally deposited onto the continent of Velios formed into the Claws of Vishan, an order of dragons dedicated to developing and perfecting the schools of magic. The Claws of Vishan were content to remain in their strongholds in Velios and stay out of the matters of the lesser races of Norath. There was, however, a splinter group within the Claws of Vishan that would come to call themselves the Ring of Scale. The Ring of Scale believed that non-dragon races should be considered a threat and should be brought under control and dominated by the dragons. The rift between the two groups grew, and eventually the Ring of Scale would leave Velios for the shores of Kunark, under the leadership of Jaled Dar. The Ring of Scale built a fortress in the mountains in the west of Kunark called Vishan's Peak. There are no records of a war between the Chisar and the Ring of Scale, although they did arrive on Kunark before the Chisar were exiled. Dragons are very long-lived, practically immortal by the standards of most races, and they tend to take their time. The Ring of Scale spent centuries on Kunark, establishing a presence and discussing amongst themselves what to do about the Xar. The threat of the Xar was slowly growing, but the leadership of the Ring of Scale chose to only intervene with their growth indirectly, rather than to risk a direct approach. A faction of younger dragons within the Ring of Scale, led by Trakanan, advocated for more direct action, but they were outnumbered. This would end up being a mistake on behalf of the Ring of Scale because the Xar would not remain ununified for long. The fate of the Xar would be forever changed with the hatching of Venril Sather of the Kunzar clan in the city of Chirasis, in what is now known as the Over There. Even as a young broodling, Venril Sather was anything but ordinary. At a young age he mastered weaponry and martial combat, but there was more to him than brute strength. He also had an endless thirst for knowledge and was at home in the ancient Xar libraries. It was not long before he killed his father, the chieftain of the Kunzar, and took his place as its leader. His search for knowledge led him to find the lost library of Kotiz, a powerful necromancer from the age of the Chisar. Hidden deep in the library of Kotiz, Venril found a large book, large enough for a man to pass through, that opened into a doorway. Venril passed through this door and found himself in a room, and at its center there floated a book bound in Xar skin, titled The Unholy Writ of War. Contained in this book were secrets of combat and warfare that had been lost for centuries. Venril Sather took the Unholy Writ of War and used the knowledge it contained to train his Kunzar tribe to fight, as well as use the magic it described to raise undead to fight alongside them. Venril quickly conquered the other 4 tribes, forcing them to unite into one Xar nation, finally giving the Xar an empire of their own. During the war to unite the Xar clans, Venril Sather met his love, Drusilla Sather, and with her by his side he named himself Emperor of the Xar. Now that the Xar were united, Venril and his army set to defeating and enslaving the other races that called Kunark home, the Giants and Froglocks. Venril Sather moved the capital of the Xar Empire to the great city of Sebilis, and it became known as the Sebilisian Empire. In Sebilis, Venril and Drusilla hatched a son who they named Ryle. As Venril aged, he became more and more aware of his own mortality, and turned to the dark arts to try and extend his life and the life of Drusilla so they could reign as immortal emperor and empress. But while he was coming up with a plan, Drusilla fell ill and died. Crushed by her loss, Venril had her essence preserved in a phylactery and placed in Chirasis, their former home, and had the city sealed off. Venril increased his efforts to become an immortal lich so he could find a way to bring Drusilla back so they could be together again. Ryle Sather, his son and heir to the Empire, had other ideas, however. He knew that if Venril attained immortality that he would never take over as emperor, so when Venril was performing the ritual that would make him an immortal, Ryle interrupted it, trapping Venril Sather's soul in an amulet that Ryle then hid away. The Xar, or Sebilisian Empire, under Ryle Sather was brutal. With the aid of his 3 warlords, Kernmacha, Karakitis, and Shosuth the Vampire, he ruled by fear and tightly controlled all of the continent of Kunark, save for the corner inhabited by the Ring of Scale. Ryle made sure that his generals had everything they needed to wage war on his enemies. Great towers were built for Kern and Karakitis. One, in what is now called the Warslick's Woods, was built for Karakitis, but it fell long ago, and knowledge of what was done there was lost with it. It was most likely used to fight against the resisting hill giant tribes in that area, led by the hill giant general Warslick. The second tower was built for Kern Macha, the dread torturer of the Sebilisian Empire and most trusted of Ryle Sathir's subjects. The tower was used to torture and interrogate enemies of the Empire that had been captured. It housed a vast and horrific collection of cruel devices that Kern Macha enjoyed personally using on his prisoners. But why was Kern trusted so completely by Ryle Sathir? Trust did not come easily among the Xar. It is not known for certain, but what is known is that Kern was an officer under Venril Sathir. After the death of Drusilla, Kern had been tasked with leading several campaigns to recover potions and spells, and other items of power that could possibly use to reunite Venril and Drusilla. On the day that Ryle interrupted Venril Sathir's necromancy ritual trapping his soul in an amulet, Kern was present, and had just returned from one of those campaigns. Many speculate that there's a connection between Kern's presence at the ritual and his promotion to Warlord. Kern's tower still stands in the Field of Bone outside of the city of Kabalis, but it is now overrun by the undead remains of Kern's victims. For his third warlord, Chosuth the Vampire, Ryle Sathir had built the 5 Towers of Taraz, the place that is now called Kesara. The 5 towers were built in a circle around a central temple, and the site was given to Chosuth to be used as libraries and alchemy laboratories, where he worked to develop magic and potions to aid in the Xar Conquests. Ryle Sathir had greater plans than simply ruling the continent of Kunark. Under Ryle, a fleet of warships was built with the intent of sailing to other shores and conquer more land for the Sebilisian Empire. Ryle liked to personally command the fleet from its flagship, the Fetid Plank, and led the fleet across the timorous deep to attack Fador. The invasion was a success, allowing the Xar to plunder the island of Fador at will for years. Ryle Sathir's iron fist and eye for expansion did not go unnoticed by the Ring of Scale. While Jalid Dar and the other elders debated how best to deal with the Xar threat, Trakanan had finally had enough and decided to deal with the problem directly. He gathered the support of many of the younger dragons in the Ring of Scale, and when he had a strong enough force, he denounced Jalid Dar and left to face Ryle Sathir. The resulting battle of the Timorous Deep saw the Xar Armada destroyed utterly, killing Ryle Sathir in the process. During the battle, Trakanan himself summoned a massive squall that turned the tide of the battle quickly, sinking most of the ships. Finishing off what remained was a trivial task for the dragons. Jalid Dar was outraged by this treason against the Ring of Scale and ordered that all who were involved be banished from Vishan's Peak and punished for what they had done. This resulted in a civil war amongst the dragons lasting 50 years. The people of Kunark could only watch as the great dragons who had for centuries watched the wars between Xar and Giant and Frogluck now take to the skies. Their battles lit up the sky and dragon corpses fell to the ground, scattering their bones across the land. While the dragons fought each other, Atrib, son of Ryle, took the reins as emperor. He sought vengeance for the death of his father at the hands of the dragons. He knew that the ways of his father would not be strong enough to face the Ring of Scale, so he looked to his grandfather, Venril Sathir, and his pursuit of dark and twisted magic. Atrib left his 3 sons to keep the Empire and its slaves in check as he retreated to his laboratory of Khor Shah, hidden in the mountains. There he experimented on captives, including froglucks, giants, young dragons that had been taken from the Ring of Scale, and even his own kind. He twisted together Dragon and Xar into a new race he called the Sarnak, who could be bred to fight on behalf of the Sebilisian Empire. They were hatched by the thousands and trained to fight and kill. But that would not be enough. The dragons fought from the air and devastated their enemies with fire and magic raining down from the sky. Atrib melded Froglockin Dragon into a flying creature he called the Sokokar, that his newly forged army could ride into battle and take the sky back from the dragons. The Sokokar would be tested against the giants, and with shocking efficiency, the giant strongholds that remained resisting the Xar were wiped out. Now only the Ring of Scale was left to be defeated. While Atrib was testing his twisted new army, the elder dragons of the Ring of Scale won their civil war. The younger dragons, led by Tracanan, were put into a stasis and banished to a magical prison where they would remain for 600 years. The Ring of Scale returned to meddling indirectly with the Xar in an attempt to keep them at bay. But before Atrib had a chance to turn his army on the dragons, one of his rituals went wrong, destroying his laboratory and most of the mountain with it. It is assumed that Atrib was killed in the incident. When word of the accident reached the army, Atrib's youngest son and top general Gannic quickly turned on his two older brothers, assassinating them and declaring himself emperor. In his first act as emperor, he took the fight to the dragons, kicking off a devastating war that would last 54 years. Led by the Sarnax and Sokokor created by his father, Gannic won decisive victory after decisive victory against the Ring of Scale, pushing them back to the Skyfire Mountains. But as I said earlier, dragons are very long-lived and are not prone to rushing to action. These defeats only serve to awaken the true fury of the Ring of Scale, who began to fight back with a vigor that the Xar had not seen yet in an enemy. The fighting was fierce. Sarnac were slaughtered by the thousands, and the great cities of Torsus and Sebilis were razed to the ground by dragonfire. The climax of the war saw Gannic and his army clash with Jalad Dar himself in the skies above the Field of Bone. Jalad Dar saw that Gannic was starting to gain the upper hand and was unwilling to fall without taking his enemy with him. Jalad Dar summoned a great fiery explosion, destroying himself and obliterating Gannic and his entire army. The ground beneath was scorched into a desert, leaving behind a crater that the body of Jalad Dar fell into. His bones remain there to this day. Gannic was hailed as a hero for taking down the great Jalad Dar, and his only son Chotal was named emperor, but the celebration was short-lived. That night, a horde of dragons swept over the imperial palace, destroying it and killing Chotal, the last of the Sathir line. Severely weakened in numbers and missing their leader, what was left of the Ring of Scale retreated to Vishan's Peak, vowing to one day return and wipe out the Xar completely. The war was over, but with it, the Sebilisian Empire had ended as well. Thank you for watching. This has been part 1 of my 2-part series on the lore of Kunark. Kunark simply has too much lore and history to do in one video, so I had to split it up a bit. I'll be back soon with part 2. Talk to you next time.